Our next speaker is one who doesn't like being kept in the dark. There's no doubt John Lolicato likes to be at the forefront of many of our water debates, and there have been many historic water reforms, even in my short life. So John is he's the chair of the Murray Valley Private Diverters. He's a committee member of Speak Up, and he said, "Let there be light," and there was. Without further ado, John Lolicato.
Thanks, Tom. Now, I've got a bit of a challenge. I've got 5 minutes to get this through, and I've got a fair bit to get through, so hopefully I'm going to be using a little bit of technology to help out, and hopefully it works a bit better than the lights. Look, to understand the issue of constraints, you first of all need to understand our river systems and the fact that they all have limited carrying capacity. In other words, the maximum flow of water that you can carry before it will leave a defied channel and go over bank. Now that's a bit of an indication of the river systems that we've got. It just shows how complex what we're dealing with, you know, because it's once the water leaves the dams, it comes down, and that actually slide is supposed to be a fair bit smaller because it's supposed to show the actual Cadell fault, because what it does, the water actually comes down, hits the wall, and then it's got to go either one way or another. And the simple fact is, it has got to fit through those channel systems. Now, being able to fit through those channel systems is a thing that we've spent 5 years with the MDBA and others to try and get them to understand. Whatever political imperative you might have, the simple fact is it won't fit. There are physical constraints in there that you can't do anything about, not unless you want to run an excavator down the Murray River and a couple of the other areas. But this, in my presentation, I will focus mainly on the Murray between Hume and the South Australian border. I would like to begin with a short geological history that takes us back 30,000 years. When there was a major geological earth movement causing an uplift of the landscape that is now known as the Cadell Fault. This vertical displacement of around 14 metres is located between Deniliquin and Echuca, and people that travel the highway out here would be well aware of the highway being up high, and you look across and you're actually looking across the top of the trees. That was caused around about 30,000 years ago, and what it did, it actually cut off the Murray River. The Murray flows due east-west, and that Cadell Fault came up 30,000 years ago, cut the Murray off, and what it caused was it caused the river to dam. The water had nowhere to go for a period of time. Eventually it headed north because there was some quite large sand dunes to the south, and it actually ended up taking over the channels of the Edward and the Gulper River. So for the next 20-odd thousand years, it actually went north into the Edward and the Gulper, before it finally, around about 8,000 years ago, not that long ago in history, it actually ended up cutting through the sandhills after a number of big floods, and it started heading down south. Now, could I go to the next one, please, Shelley? Yeah, well, that's an overview of the system, and just to try to simplify it as much as we possibly could, you've got Dartmouth here in the corner, the 4,000 GL, 3,000 GL's Hume, and what we've got is 4 major constraints. Now, the first of the major constraints is the Hume to Yarrawonga section, 25,000 megs. That's all that you can get through there. Turn the clock back about 30-odd years. That section there, the registered constraint was around about somewhere just under 20,000. It was 18 to 20,000 megs. With government actually, I'll just read this a little bit. The original bank capacity was less than 20,000 megalitres. Over the years through to 2004, the government assisted landholders through bridge building and negotiated easements to increase the channel carrying capacity to 25,000. So that's something a lot of people aren't aware of, that the actual channel capacity there was less than what it is now, but due to negotiations and other things, they actually did get it increased to 25,000 because there was a need to try to increase the amount of volume of water we got downstream. So that's exactly where we are now with the other constraints. If we move to the next one, please, Sally. I'll just go through them one at a time. The main one there, of course, is the Hume to Yarrawonga, has an in-bank capacity now of 25,000. The proposed flows are talking up to 40,000. And remember, when you put that water up there, it's got to keep going all the way down the system. So it actually has an effect right through the system. If you start, the higher up you put the water, it's got to go through somewhere. Next, please. Then the next one down is what the called the Milliwa Choke, which is downstream of Tokemore. Did have a capacity of 10,600. That capacity now is still a bit debatable, but most of the river managers have accepted that it's reduced to under 10,000 megs. So what's happening, the chokes that we've got are gradually starting to collapse because we're trying to put too much water through. And that's with today's water. Next one, please, Shelley. And then the next one down, water travelling downstream after the Milliwa Choke. Water's got the option of going two ways. Either it goes north into the Edward Gulper or it comes south through the Barmer Choke. So the Barmer Choke's down here and the Edward is to the north. So the fact of that is that when you look at the next slide, please, you've got, this one sort of shows the chokes a little bit to a degree, but if you have a look at it, the Edward Gulper Choke is around about 1950, add the two together, that's the maximum volume you could get through there without going over bank, and then any water that goes to the south has got to go through the Barmer Choke. And so the Barmer Choke was 8,500, that's what was registered as the carrying capacity. That now has reduced to under 8,000. Now, it's a fact that both of those chokes they're trying to force too much water through it over a long period of time. And the thing that we can't get the MDBA or others to accept is that these extra volumes of water that people are talking about now, you know, especially the 450, because there's not many places the 450 can come from. It has got to come out of the Murray system. If it's going to come out of the Murray system, it has got to go either north or south. So the volumes that we're talking about already, the rivers cannot sustain it. Anyone that wants to go for a drive, have a look at the Milliwa Choke, the Barmer Choke, the rivers there, both the banks have actually, the river's 1.2 to 3 metres wider than what it was traditionally because the banks are getting wider and it's actually silting up. So the part that we've had with the constraint strategy being such a hard thing to get through to our, especially the MDBA, is to get them to accept the fact that you can have whatever political imperative you want. You can have whatever political goal you want. You know, you might want to flush dilute the Southern Ocean. The bottom line is you've got to get the water there. And the real place that the water's got to come from is the Murray system, because the Murray is the main system. You've got the Burrum-Michigan. Yep, I'm getting the wind up already. But so if we move to the next one, the South Australian border. Now, under the basin plan, Jan spoke about it before, that the proposed flows down there, 60 to 80,000 megalitres at the South Australian border. Now, all of that has got to come from somewhere. You've got the Murrumbidgee, you've got the Darling, and you've got the Murray. Now, the bottom line is, I'm not too sure what they're doing with the Darling anymore. I think that's a topic by itself, but the management of that is just unbelievable. But the Murrumbidgee is only going to provide a set amount because they've got their own constraints. The vast majority of where the water is being acquired is the Murray system. So overall, the vast majority of water has got to come through the Murray system all the way down to try to provide that 60 to 80,000. Next one, please. The thing that I really do need to emphasise is that while we talk about channel capacity, physical constraints are not the only issue. One of the next major dilemmas our river operators will have to deal with in the very near future is being able to supply the ever-increasing demand downstream. With the tens of thousands of hectares of new horticulture and even more planned downstream of Swan Hill, plus the ever-increasing demand for e-water, also downstream, our rivers will not be able to supply the demand requested, which will cause rationing, and not only for the new users, but I suspect all users that with existing licences include. Now, the reason I've included that's one of the pump sites that's gone in downstream. Now, we've already seen what's happened on the Barwon Darling, the pumps that have been put in there, ridiculously, 15 pumps in a row, dragged out of a little creek. Okay, you're going to pull water out in high times, but our rivers are small. They're only relatively small channels. You start a pump like that up, you can turn the thing backwards. And the problem is we've got government agencies, planners, not addressing these issues. This is happening as we speak. Downstream of Swan Hill in particular, go for a run in a boat, and you'll see setups like this all over the place. They're irrigating country that should have never been irrigated, but they're dragging too much water out. The way the system was before, everyone had a 12-inch pump or a 14-inch pump, whatever it was naturally throttled. You put 10,000 megs down, everyone got a bit of a go at it. Start allowing this sort of rubbish to go on, and we'll end up the same as what the Barwon Darling is. So we've got to start standing up against this stuff because they all acknowledge it. MDBA, New South Wales planners, Victorian planners, and they all throw their hands up in the air. What can we do about it? We don't want to guide who develops what. I'm not saying don't grow almonds, don't grow. All that I'm saying, you've got existing irrigators, you've got existing concerns that actually belong to the environment and others, so at least recognise that, and before you allow the multi-million-dollar plantings to go ahead, say, listen, you'll be a second-class irrigator compared to what's there. But anyway, I'm going to keep moving. I said I was going to stick to the script, so I do start to ramble a bit too much if I don't. Now, these ones here are the... no, they're just back a couple of things, mate. One more. These are the environmental pumps that are already going in downstream, so it's not just the productive sector that's putting these pumps in. These pumps are actually down at Hatter and Chewilla, and I'm not sure the exact location of each one of them, but these are for environmental watering. So they can actually provide environmental water to some of these assets away from the river. That's an indication of a couple of the pumps. That's another one. And I'll just take you back to this because this is a pretty important part. Just to remind you, let me just remind you that this is what is already happening to the river upstream flows we have today. That's part of the Millawa Choke, and as you can see, that would have been out 2 to 3 metres originally, and the channel bank is gradually just eroding away, and that's with the flows we've got today. Forget about the extra water that the environment and everyone else is claiming. It has got to go through this section, through there and the Edward. Right. Right, mate. What have we got there? In conclusion, I do need to read this bit. Since I've been talking about the significance of history, let us not forget the legacy that our forefathers' forward planning has provided our generation. Without dams, the Murray River would have run dry at least 8 times since Federation. So that's just an indication of the way, without proper forward planning, which is what our forefathers did do, the river would have run dry at least 8 to 15 times, but I'm using 8 to try to be conservative. And now we've got a system that does work, and it works beautifully, but the problem is our planners have got to get back to the basics. You haven't got an Isle or a Ganges. You've got a relatively small channel system that does need to be recognised. And at this stage, through the constraint strategy, every time that we've had the opportunity, well, I've spent 3 years on this, or a number of us have, and every time we get somebody from the MDVA to understand it, they end up getting shifted sideways because they take it back to camera and say, hey, listen, you can't do it for these reasons. Oh, sorry, you can go and do the Bow and Darling, we'll get somebody else. So that's where our problem is. We need to acknowledge the physical realities that you physically can't get the bloody stuff down there. I don't care what the politics of it is, we've got to stand up to it. All right, thanks.